Chapter 34. Joining the Hope. Once he had left the inn, Reyes took to the air again and flew the short distance back to Harpy town. He landed smoothly, just in front of the hut that he and Gaggara had called home for the last half of the year, and went inside. Reyes found his equipment lying on the floor of the hut, exactly where he had left it all those months before. It seemed that Gaggara had been right when she assured him that his stuff would be safe in the hut. Using what little light was coming through the doorway, Reyes put the bracelets on first. Then he fastened the belt about his waist. He had worn nothing more than a loose skirt for the last few months, and even the mere presence of the belt made him feel a little strange. It didn't help that the sword had remained attached to the belt all this time, and as light as it was while it remained in its scabbard, Reyes could still feel the difference. A quick check of the belt's pouches, and Reyes found the 2 silver coins, as well as the money that he had gotten in exchange for the horse. As dark as it was in the hut, he decided not to stay and count it. Besides, the fact that some of the coins were still there made him think that all the coins were likely to be there. Finally, Reyes picked up the quiver, still containing the 7 arrows that he had entered the city with, and the short bow that had been given to him as a birthday present by his brother Greyforth all those many years ago. The quiver he was able to attach to his belt without any problem. However, the bow had been lying on the dirt floor of the hut for the last 6 months. He hadn't really even thought about it in all that time. He hadn't polished it, he hadn't oiled it. To put it simply, he hadn't looked after it, and it had been a very harsh winter. Even in the vague light of the hut, Reyes could tell that the bow was badly warped. Reyes worried for a moment that the winter might also have damaged his sword in some way. He unsheathed the blade and checked it for blemishes. There was no sign of anything wrong with the weapon. It was as clean as it had been the night he had left the castle. Reyes had one more thing to do before he could leave the hut. Gaggara had given him the task of fetching her pretty stones. He found them in the same place they had been when she had first brought them out to show him all those many months ago. As he picked up the small wooden box that they were kept in, he couldn't help thinking that the box was probably worth a lot more than the stones it contained. It was a beautifully ornate box with a lovely gold leaf design, although most of the design had been worn off of it over the years, leaving just a few patches of gold leaf and a rough outline of the original pattern. Once he was out of the hut again, Reyes hovered by the entrance for a minute or two. This had been his home for the last 6 months, and somehow it didn't feel right to just desert the place like this. There were many happy memories associated with this hut. He remembered his first night here, staying in a place that was as alien to his home as it was possible to be. Gaggara had made him feel so welcome. If it hadn't been for her, he didn't know how he might have ended up. Eventually Reyes did turn his back on the hut, though he did so regretfully. He had to get back to Gaggara before she began to worry as to what had happened to him. He began to walk slowly over to the fire pit. He felt it would be good to have something to eat before he left. The reception Reyes got from the girls of Harpy town was so much better than he remembered it being during those first few days. It was clear to them now that he hadn't come to this part of the town to look for girls to recruit to his village. He was here because he was a reject, just like everyone else. What was more, they had gotten used to the idea of having a male in the town, and he no longer had small crowds of girls following him wherever he went. Likewise, the young children who were working at the fire pits were so used to seeing him every day that they no longer giggled whenever he showed his face. Even Lingwalt, the harpy with the huge gaping hole in the centre of one of her wings, seemed to be a lot more accepting of Reyes these days. It was probably just as well. Lingwalt seemed to be in charge of the fire pits now. She had taken over as the woman in charge of the fire pits sometime during the winter months, when Henfin had failed to make an appearance one morning. It had been a harsh winter. It wasn't hard to guess what fate had befallen the elderly harpy. "You look ready to take on the entire goblin army, Tanrag," Lingwalt commented as Reyes took some of the meat off of one of the bull carcass halves roasting on the spits. "I haven't seen you so equipped for war since the day you first arrived." "Hi, Lingwalt," Reyes greeted. "Afraid I'm joining the army, so you won't have to put up with my presence around town for that much longer." "Oh," Lingwalt had definitely mellowed in the time since Reyes had first set foot in Harpy town. "Don't be like that. Who are you joining?" "The Hope," Reyes admitted unhappily. He still felt that joining the Hope was one of the biggest mistakes he was ever going to make. "The 421st?" Lingwalt asked. "That's the one," Reyes agreed. "Lagnoff's regiment?" Lingwalt stated. Well, I can't say I'm surprised. It was only a matter of time before Gaggara found an excuse to go and join her mother. Reyes took a bite out of the meat. Apparently the taxes are too heavy, and she can't afford to live here anymore. The taxes are heavy, Lingwalt agreed, but I think there's more to it than that. You see, Lagnov's village was attacked and destroyed by humans just before Gaggara was born. They slaughtered her friends and family wholesale. They killed her chief and they killed her best friend, after whom she later named her child Gaggara. Lagnov wants revenge on the humans, even if it means losing her own life to get it. I'm pretty sure that some of that hate has rubbed off on her daughter. That sounds awful, Reyes commented. Which duke was responsible? I don't know, Lingwalt admitted. One of the more northern ones, I think. Lagnov has never been too clear on the point. Then she changed the subject. Anyway, take care. I'd hate for anything to happen to you. Thank you, Reyes told her. Then, trying to add a light-hearted note, he said, I'll try not to get myself killed. Lingwalt didn't seem impressed. She just said, see to it that you don't. Reyes left the fire pit wondering which duke could do such a thing. If it was one of the more northern dukes, then there were only two possibilities. His father, Duke de Moth, or his grandfather, Duke Grespa. Somehow Reyes found it hard to believe that either would be capable of such an atrocity. He was still thinking about what Lingwalt had told him when he reached the practice archery targets. As always, there were a small number of Harpies there testing their skills with short bows and dart throwers. Most of them were young, but even adults needed to refresh their skills occasionally, and Reyes wasn't surprised to see some huntresses taking their turn amidst the youngsters. It suddenly occurred to Reyes that he should try his bow. It might be warped, but with the bracelets he was still likely to hit the bullseye every time, and maybe the bow wasn't as badly damaged as it looked. He placed Gaggara's box of pretty stones gently on the floor, and then placed his right foot on it to ensure that nothing happened to the box while he was taking his shot. He then knocked one of his 7 remaining arrows to his warp bow, and fired. The bow felt awkward, and the arrow wanted to veer off dangerously to the left, and was only kept on target thanks to the magic of the bracelets. At least they still worked. The arrow struck the target that Reyes had aimed for, hitting it in the dead centre of the bullseye. But it had been a most unsatisfactory shot. What was worse, as Reyes pulled back the string of the bow, he thought he heard the sound of wood splintering. Reyes let the bow drop to the ground. It was a shame to lose such a weapon, especially as it had been a gift from his brother, but if the wood was splintering, then it wasn't going to be of much use. He considered losing the arrows as well, but decided to keep them. They were still in fairly good condition, and Reyes was going to have to get a new bow sooner or later anyway. Reyes turned and headed towards the gates of Harpy Town. He knew he should probably take to the air and fly back to Gaggara, who must be wondering what had happened to him, but he wasn't sure if he'd ever be coming back this way, and this had been his home for the last 6 months or so. He felt that it would have been nice had he had the opportunity to take one final look around the castle before he had been forced to escape on that fateful night, but that had been denied to him. One of the Harpies on self-appointed lookout duty on one of the towers caught sight of Reyes walking slowly through the huts of Harpy Town. She left her perch and landed on one of the huts nearby and greeted him. "Hello, Danrag." Hello," Reyes replied. There was something familiar about her, and yet Reyes had no idea who she was. The Harpy left the roof of the hut and landed no more than a foot in front of where Reyes was standing. "Going somewhere, sweetie?" Reyes nodded. "Gaggara not here?" she asked, tilting her head just slightly. "She's waiting for me," Reyes said. He looked at the girl in front of him, feeling very suspicious. The girl smiled. She put her hands on his shoulders, and then let them slide, so that she was face to face with him with her hands around his back. "You know, she did promise me that you and I would have some fun. That was absolutely ages ago, and I'm still waiting." Reyes took a step back. "Tifneg?" Reyes said, finally recognizing her. Tifneg smiled and nodded. Guilty, she started to stroke the tips of his wings, in a way that Reyes found ever so slightly erotic. I'm not interested," Reyes told her. He took another step back. Tifneg took a step forward and linked her hands together behind his head, so he couldn't just slip out of her grip. "Oh, come on. Gaggara won't mind. It was she that made me the promise in the first place. Besides, if it really bothers you..." Her voice lowered to little more than a conspiratorial whisper as she continued, "We just won't tell her." "No," Reyes insisted. He ducked his head under Tifneg's arms and took another step back. He looked around for help, but no one else seemed to be paying the two even the slightest bit of notice. "Such forcefulness," Tifneg commented. "But it really isn't your call, dear. I'm here to claim a debt." "A debt?" Reyes questioned. He found he had backed into another hut. He had run out of paths to take. "A promise is as good as a debt," Tifneg explained. She pinned Reyes to the hut, cutting off any means he might otherwise have had to escape. "I'm devoted to Gaggara," Reyes insisted. He couldn't think straight, and he was beginning to panic. "That's nice," Tifneg replied, uncaring. "Now kiss me." Reyes felt trapped. He fully intended to stay faithful to Gaggara, but Tifneg was definitely a very pretty girl, and the way she was coming on to him, she was making it very hard for him to stick to his principles. He couldn't help but think that had he met Tifneg before he had met Gaggara, this entire scene might even be playing out in reverse, with him being devoted to the girl currently standing before him. A niggling voice in the back of his head kept whispering to him that it wouldn't hurt to settle the debt. He did his best to ignore the voice. Reyes eventually realised what he was going to have to do, but was hesitant to do so. If anyone saw him, he was going to have a lot of explaining to do. The alternative, though, seemed to be to give in to his instincts and take advantage of the situation. He would have an hour of fun, followed by a lifetime of regret. Tifneg wasn't making it easy for him. Her hands had started trying to wander to parts of his body that he felt they had no right exploring. He had to grab her hands by the wrist to stop them from wandering, and Tifneg was very strong. "Let's have some fun," she purred gleefully. "Go to sleep," Reyes ordered. In order to make the required gesture with his hand, he had had to release one of Tifneg's wrists. He tried to compensate by blocking her now free hand with his knee, but her groping was very distracting. The girl looked at Reyes strangely. She almost took a step back as she said, "What?" "I said go to sleep," Reyes repeated. Tifneg giggled. Then she leaned in and kissed Reyes on the cheek, telling him, "Oh, you're so cute. Pretending to cast magic, I can see why Gaggara loves you." Reyes looked puzzledly at the girl in front of him. Why wasn't the spell working? Why hadn't Tifneg lost consciousness, and how could he get her to stop kissing him? "You're very playful today," Tifneg giggled. "Come on, hold me closer. Make love to me. I promise I won't bite." "Go to sleep," Reyes tried again. He was in a panic and wasn't even sure he'd cast the spell properly. It didn't even occur to him that in his panic he'd slipped into the flourished tongue. Tifneg suddenly slumped in an untidy pile at his feet and began to snore in a most unfeminine manner. Reyes sighed heavily. He glanced quickly at the nearby huts. There was a lot of movement, but no one seemed to be paying too much attention to what Reyes and Tifneg had been doing. It looked to Reyes as if he had gotten away with it. He wasn't all that far from the gates of Harpy Town, but Tifneg had scared him. Reyes decided to cut the rest of his tour of Harpy Town short and fly back to the barracks. Gaggara wasn't waiting over by the enlistment hut as she had promised. Reyes found her back by the fire pits, talking with her mother. Indeed, she seemed to have taken over her mother's task. She sat on the stool, turning the spit that held what was left of the pig. Her mother stood nearby, carefully perched on a fallen tree trunk that looked as if it had been positioned for just that purpose. Agnar, also nearby, didn't seem to mind that Gaggara was doing the job her mother had been given. Reyes assumed everything was all right with the world, so long as someone was doing it. He landed gently on the roof of the building next to the fire pit and crouched down, listening in to what they were saying. "Well," Ragnar was saying, "I have to admit I had my doubts when I first met her." "Me too, Mother," Gaggara replied. "A male, on her own, in the middle of the city. I wasn't sure she had survived the month. I'm glad she did. I think I love her." "And she's found no other girls?" Ragnar asked. "Well," Gaggara admitted, "she hasn't exactly been inundated with offers. However, I think that even if she had been, she would turn them down. I think she's devoted to me." "Really?" Ragnar commented. "It's strange," Gaggara said. "In a way I appreciate having her all to myself, and yet I do feel as if it would be nice to be a part of something bigger. I'd like to be the leader of her village." "Make the most of what you have," Ragnar replied. "Does she love you?" "She does. I know she does," Gaggara revealed. "She has told me so many times, and though she hasn't said anything to the effect, I think she would like to make it a more permanent arrangement." "More permanent?" Ragnar said, surprised. "What, You mean like marriage or something? Yes, Gaggara said. I know it's silly, Harpies simply don't get married. Yet there are times I have felt she's on the verge of proposing, and only changes her mind at the last minute. Maybe I'm just a romantic fool. Reyes almost couldn't believe his ears. He'd love to marry Gaggara. It was just that she was so set in her ways that he had been certain she would turn him down, and he didn't want to face the rejection. Gaggara, he said from the rooftop, will you marry me? Gaggara turned her head round and looked at him. Handsome! How long have you been there? She jumped out of her chair and was airborne within a second. She almost knocked him down as she reached him, wrapping her arms around him as far as his wings would allow. You were a long time. I missed you, she commented. She then kissed him twice before grabbing his nose gently between her teeth. Reyes took Gaggara lovingly in his arms and held her tight. Now this was the girl he felt comfortable getting close to. Perhaps you should accept before she changes her mind, Lagnoff joked. Lagnoff was sitting back on the stool Gaggara had just vacated and was again turning the spit. Gaggara laughed. She kissed Reyes again and then said over her shoulder, That wasn't a serious proposal, Mother. She just overheard our conversation. I know that, dear, Lagnoff responded. Reyes wanted to tell them both that his proposal had been serious, but it seemed as if the moment was gone. Gaggara was holding on to him tightly, as if she never intended to let him out of her sight again. I assume you haven't signed up yet, Reyes commented. He didn't really want to sign up. It was dangerous to join the Hope, and besides, signing up would mean leaving the heaven of just staying here all day with Gaggara in his arms. Gaggara also seemed to have other ideas. Perhaps she wanted to be reassured that he really did have strong feelings for her. She started trying to force him to lay flat on the roof. Her hands started to wander the entire length of his body, and she clasped her teeth even tighter about his nose, in a way that Reyes found extremely erotic. Not here, Reyes commented, suddenly realizing what Gaggara wanted, yet he couldn't resist kissing her. Why not? She replied, her teeth releasing him just long enough for her to speak. Then she clamped her teeth tightly about his left ear. Come on, take me here. Reyes shivered as the pain of her bite filled him with almost uncontrollable lust. Not in the compound, not in front of everyone, not in front of your mother. She pulled back and kissed him gently on the nose. There was a smile on her cute face as she teased, Why, I never thought of you as being shy. Reyes didn't want to let go, but neither did he really want to give a free show to those gathered in the compound. As he looked around, though, only Gaggara's mother seemed to be paying more than a passing interest to the event happening on the rooftop. To the rest of the Harpies gathered at the nearby fire pit, it was clearly nothing to get excited about. We should sign up if we're going to. Maybe we can find somewhere less public a little later. That's a promise, Gaggara teased. She prodded his chest with her finger. Remember, it's my birthday. Today you're mine. She then rested her teeth gently on his nose for just a second. When she did let go, she took hold of his hand. You're very affectionate today, Reyes claimed. Gaggara giggled. I guess so. Come on, let's join up.